What is youth? A dream. What is love? The dream's content.
Hello everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Sound and Sophia. Today we're embarking on Søren Kierkegaard's so-called life spheres or life stages. Basically, there are three different stages, and you can almost say that these stages are three different ways of orienting your own life. It's almost like three separate philosophies.
The three main spheres are the aesthetic sphere, the ethical sphere, and the religious sphere. And today we're discussing the aesthetic.
Before we begin with the aesthetic sphere, I want to teach you a new word that I'm going to use throughout these next three episodes. And the word is telos.
Definition: telos, end, purpose, or goal, is a term used by the philosopher Aristotle to refer to the full potential or inherent purpose or objective of a person or a thing, similar to the notion of an end goal or raison d'être. Moreover, it can be understood as the supreme end of man's endeavor.
This word here is very important because the way I look at it is that these life spheres that Søren talks about have different teloses, different life goals within themselves.
By the way, children should probably not be included in any of these spheres. Like we discussed in episode 3, they are innocent and ignorant. A deeper sense of self-reflection is needed to enter the spheres.
So let's begin, you guys. The aesthetic sphere. Well, a person who lives in the aesthetic sphere is not a person who just likes art and music. It should be seen in the old classic Greek meaning, the word aesthetikos, which basically means a perception of the senses. So the senses, our bodily senses, is what's on focus here.
So the senses are central here. More or less, the aesthetic sphere is a kind of hedonism. Hedonism is also a Greek word, meaning pleasure. In ancient Greece, they more or less had a specific god or deity for everything in the world. And the same goes for hedonism. Hedon was the daughter of the god Eros and the goddess Psyche. So oddly enough, hedon is the result of the unification of love and soul. One of Socrates' students, Aristippus, founder of the Cyrenaic school, argues in favor of a hedonistic lifestyle. He was overall skeptical of any type of knowledge, except for knowledge of the immediate senses, what someone experiences in the immediate.
So to Aristippus, the only thing that I really can have any knowledge about at all is solely our senses, our sense data. So logically, we should aim at maximizing our sensual pleasure at all times. Now the key factor here in the aesthetic sphere is to focus on the ego, because I can't have knowledge at all about any other person's sense data. So I should always focus on my own. And even if I would help anyone else, I would just do it for the sake that they would help me later. So it's a very egotistical way of thinking of life.
So let's go back to Søren. We can find the aesthetic sphere depicted in two books. The first part of Either Or and the first part of Stages on Life's Way.
If you remember from the very first episode that we did on Kierkegaard, we discussed the Socratic irony and all his pseudonyms. And in the book Either Or, that was written under the pseudonym Victor Eremita, we get to meet the real aesthetic person. And here is a quote that really illuminates the aesthetic sphere.
If you marry, you will regret it. If you do not marry, you will also regret it. If you marry or if you do not marry, you will regret both. Whether you marry or you do not marry, you will regret both. Laugh at the world's follies, you will regret it. Weep over them, you will also regret it. If you laugh at the world's follies or if you weep over them, you will regret both. Whether you laugh at the world's follies or you weep over them, you will regret both. Believe a girl, you will regret it. If you do not believe her, you will also regret it. If you believe a girl or you do not believe her, you will regret both. Whether you believe a girl or you do not believe her, you will regret both. If you hang yourself, you will regret it. If you do not hang yourself, you will regret it. If you hang yourself or you do not hang yourself, you will regret both. Whether you hang yourself or you do not hang yourself, you will regret both. This, gentlemen, is the sum of all practical wisdom.
So what is Mr. A really doing here? Well, to me, this is the end point of an aesthetic philosophy. If you remember from the last episode we did on Kierkegaard, what happens when you compare something that is finite with the infinite? It becomes infinitely small. So if you're solely living in a finite moment, it will sooner or later become insignificant, which means that any decision you make will become insignificant. So it doesn't matter what you choose, you will regret it. So to me, he's actually expressing a type of nihilism towards freedom. Before we continue, I think we need a little bit of an elaboration on how Kierkegaard defined time itself.
Time. Such a fleeting and mysterious thing. There are many different definitions of this strange phenomenon. But the interesting thing is how we humans, our consciousness, relates to it. Kierkegaard talks about time in the concept of anxiety, and I quote, "The moment is that ambiguity in which time and eternity touches each other, and with this the concept of temporality is posited, whereby time constantly intersects eternity and eternity constantly pervades time. As a result, the above-mentioned division acquires its significance. The present time, the past time, and the future time." End quote. And it is in this intersection of the past eternity and the future eternity, or the moment, that the aesthetic man lives. Remember, the goal is to maximize pleasure, and pleasure does not dwell in either the past or the future.
So the key factors in the aesthetic sphere is the egotistical self, the immediate moment, and sensual pleasure as telos. Here is a quote from The Seducer's Diary that will illuminate what I mean. Your Johannes. These days, when I cannot be with her in person whenever I want, the thought has troubled me that it might occur to her at some moment to consider the future. So far, that hasn't happened. I have been too good at drugging her aesthetically. Nothing less erotic is imaginable than this talk of the future, the reason for which is basically that people have nothing with which to fill the present. When I'm there, I have no fear of that either, for I can make her forget both time and eternity. In Either Or, Søren spends a whole chapter on arguing why Mozart's Don Giovanni is the pinnacle of aesthetic achievement. I truly believe that Søren was a big admirer of Mozart. I'm not going to spend so much time on the arguments themselves, but I'm going to give you a little thought experiment. What if we would completely stop time? Which discipline in the arts would you be unable to consume? The answer is music, because music is dependent on time itself.
What I mean is that if you would remove time, the immediate moment, so to say, out of the equation, you would still be able to appreciate paintings, sculptures, or literature. But without time, there is no music. Sure, you can have music on paper, but no one would be able to perform the music without time.
This is why music is the highest form of art in the aesthetic sphere, because it lives solely in the immediate moment, the same place where the aesthetic man lives. This is why Mozart's Don Giovanni should be considered the pinnacle of aesthetic achievement, because it combines the immediacy of music with the most immediate sensual pleasure, namely sex.
Sex can completely take hold of an individual and transform him into an animal of the immediate. He can lose himself in the act, and he will not return until the act is over. And when it is over, it's completely gone. Sexual pleasure is bound to the immediate moment. Alcohol is another one of those aesthetic things. Usually we might think of a good person being one who sacrifices the present moment for the future. But alcohol is the very opposite of that. It is a sacrifice of the future, i.e. the hangover next day, for the immediate pleasure in the present.
And in the book, Stages on Life's Way, the very first part, also known as In Vino Veritas, in wine there is truth, we get to follow a group of men having a discussion about women. So they take turns lecturing about what their view on women. And it's clear that all of these men are in the aesthetic sphere. So here's a couple of quotes from that part of the book.
Johannes says, "These I call the erotics, and I count myself as one of them. Men call them seducers. Women lack a name, but for her they are unmentionable. These erotics are the happy ones." Constantine. No youngling bestows even half of much imaginary ideality as a young girl. For all hers is imagined. If one does not regard women in this way, she can bring about irreparable damage. Therefore have I refrained from all love, for my mind is everything to me. Is love lust's highest bliss, will I abstain from it without insulting or envy anyone. Is love the requisite for the best charity, then I refuse to take that chance, for I would have saved my mind. The quote from the young man is a very interesting one. I believe there are many different ways of interpreting his statements and how Søren thought of it. Maybe he's not even in the aesthetic sphere at all, for he refuses to even relate to women. He is ignorant of the whole affair, or Kierkegaard believes a too big of trust in logic and science belongs in the aesthetic category. But one thing is for sure, his ego is what's important for him. His mind before anything else.
Also, this part of the book is clearly inspired by Plato's Symposium, where Socrates meets up with a couple of friends, where they take turns in giving their view on what love is. Like we discussed in the last episode on Kierkegaard, a person living solely in the moment is not a free, choice-making individual. So the whole aesthetic sphere is bound to a deterministic worldview. He's only following his pleasures. The problem with the aesthetic sphere is that sooner or later, the great abyss of the infinite will knock on the door, and with it comes despair.
Like I said in the last episode, the aesthetic person might succeed in distracting herself away from the despair, and at this moment, or as Søren would have put it, in the movement of the synthesis, she gets a choice. Either she can go back to the aesthetic way of life, or she jumps into the next stage, which is the ethical sphere.
And the ethical sphere is the subject for our next episode. So, as always, thanks again for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and also hit the like button if you got any value out of this. And support me on Patreon. I'll see you next time when we will be discussing the ethical sphere.